Welcome to the latest in our View from the Bridge series. Our topic today is, has the Conservative government fallen out of love with business? Has populism trumped profit? And we came up with the title before the presidential election, so how prescient are we? And we have some extremely well-informed speakers to debate with us. Chris Hope, Assistant Editor and Chief Political Correspondent of the Daily Telegraph and scourge of Thameslink. Yes. Those of you who follow him on Twitter, I do recommend it. Chris started his career at the Telegraph as business correspondent, moving up to industry editor, so he knows what he's talking about. And we will give the political background to the government's attitude towards business and how that's been coloured by the BHS, Sports Direct scandals, its commitment to jams, and of course, Brexit. Dr. Adam Marshall, 2 months in the role of Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, and before that it's Executive Director for Policy and External Affairs. Adam is going to give his views on how government policies are impacting business and his 52 member chambers, and what its priorities should be. Speaking after the Tory conference, Adam said, we need government to act in partnership with business, not to dictate to it. But he was at number 10 yesterday, so maybe he'll give us the inside story. And finally, Tom Tugendhat, MP for Tunbridge, Edenbridge and Malin. Tom became an MP in 2015, and he increased his share of the vote and got an even larger majority than his predecessor, over 23,000. That's the same majority as someone else who was an MP until very recently.
Any plans referendum?
Tom left the British Army in July 2013 after a career in which he served in Iraq and Afghanistan and was military assistant to the Chief of the Defence Staff. He's also worked in the city and been a journalist and set up a PR consultancy in the Lebanon. So he's not one of those MPs who've never worked outside the Westminster bubble. One of his priorities is pushing for a fairer, more transparent savings system in the UK. I'm sure we could all agree with that. And Tom will give his views as to how Westminster and business should work together as we enter the murky waters of the Brexit negotiations. Said that B word again. So I'm going to ask each speaker to make some introductory remarks, and then it's over to you to ask questions. Please tweet if you want to, but please use the hashtag VFTB. So, without further ado, Chris.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and Deborah. I commute on the bedpan line, if you know that line. I was sobered up across it recently. I was tweeting quite aggressively from West Hampstead Thameslink station as trains flew past, and by the end I was supporting Jeremy Corbyn's plans to nationalise the railways. And then I got vaguely interested in it, then I managed to get wind of Chris Greyling's plans this morning, which look a bit like halfway house territory, but so I'm rather pleased with this morning. I think it's rather good news for Tom's government. So has the government fallen out of love with business? Well, I think, Theresa May is very much unformed. She basically she was a very good departmental minister who just locked down on anything that wasn't important to her. And she's finding it quite a challenge to adapt to the idea that when you're Prime Minister running the country, anything can come at you. I think trying to understand how she understands the world from her point of view, she rather like a reader, like I view the world through the eyes of a Telegraph reader, you probably view it through your client's eyes, or if you're a company, through your customer's eyes. She looks at it through the eyes of the voter, and the voter she's thinking about, which you may be familiar with if you read the FT, is the just about managings. They're called jams in short. This is quite a big group of people. The key word in just about managings is the word about, because it's a lot of people. The Resolution Foundation reckoned there's around 6 million people on low to middle incomes, and they're spread from Lancashire to North Devon. The jam household, this is the people we're talking about, can be earning anything up to £50,000 a year, which is, of course, is more than the top rate of tax. But most they get most income from work, but it's topped up by benefits. So these are the key group through which you should view all that Theresa May does. I mean, in many ways, you could summarise the new world with Theresa May. If David Cameron looked after the Shire Tory, and Jeremy Corbyn looks after the inner city Tory, then there's no question Theresa May looks after the suburbia. She's the queen of suburbia, and that's how I would view her, certainly. But once you get that, everything then flows from it, and explains her recent attacks on business. And there's been three main critiques in the 5 months she's been Prime Minister. There's been three main critiques of her, three main opportunities to attack business: at the party conference, a speech at the Guildhall, and more recently at the CBI. And I would view her, I mean, she's made quite clear in these speeches she's very pro-business. I mean, she really is, but in a way she's more kind of a certain type of business, and not pro-all business, but a certain type. She talked of the privileged few getting richer and richer and the need to share the wealth. She described herself as pro-business and pro-free market, but really it's not the wrong kind of business, and that's the key point. And playing by the, an example about being playing by the rules on tax and good behaviour and investing for the long term. And that's why you can bring in the issues at BHS with Philip Green and Sports Direct to agree with Mike Ashley. And so, although she didn't name those two individuals in her speeches, some would argue that her criticism at the wrong kind of business was aimed at least those two individuals, if not more. So we've seen policies emerge so far which have already been watered down, as she's finding uncomfortably in government. Workers on boards was one. Now that's been slightly watered down in a rather elegant U-turn at the CBI conference, which I attended. Companies will not be forced to have workers on the boards. They can sort of work out how it fits their model. So have worker consultation, but not on the board, so she won't, quote, mandate companies. Another good area I thought was interesting was this idea of a patient capital, so how to break down obstacles to long-term investments and get shareholders sticking with the company for the long term rather than churning the investment every 3 or 5 years, which of course is the model for a lot of the VCs in this area. And then of course there was this attack on pay ratios, which bizarrely might not work so well if everyone's paid loads of money in a company like Goldman Sachs. It may not actually work that well as she sees it, trying to make it easier for the jams. But more, those are the three headline moments, but I thought there were more clues on her views on business in a speech she gave on the 11th of July this year, which I went to in Birmingham. Now that is a significant date, which you may not recognise or remember, but it was the day upon which Andrea Leadsom pulled out of the Conservative leadership and she became de facto Prime Minister. So I went with her team to Birmingham. We sat there and we did a Q&A. She gave a speech, which is a very, very thoughtful speech, written by, I imagine, Nick Timothy, who a lot of us know as one of her Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was rather overlooked in what she said because of what happened that day, which Andrea Leadsom pulled out. She spoke at 11, and Leadsom pulled out at midday, so we were there waiting for and then she became Prime Minister in Birmingham, surprisingly. But the language is so interesting, and if I can email you a copy of the speech if you haven't got it, because I have it, and it's very interesting reading it. She talked then about how she would defend, quote, defend some sectors. She attacked transient shareholders who did nothing to protect Cadbury from Kraft, for example, which some would say was not a good deal for Cadbury workers because they shut down Bourneville, having said they wouldn't do in the West Midlands. And also she attacked the near sale of AstraZeneca to Pfizer. She said, this is one of the quotes from the speech, that shareholders are not the only ones with an interest when firms are sold or closed. Workers have a stake, local communities have a stake, and often the whole country has a stake. So that's really interesting how she sees kind of these companies are not just the shareholders or anyone's, they are all of ours, right? So it's kind of community feel towards companies. She described AstraZeneca as the jewel in the UK's pharmaceutical crown. It's really interesting that she thinks obviously there are some key areas that she will defend in power, and you know, whether you can look at sort of Nissan maybe with the deal done there to stop them, to make sure the electric car came to the northeast. But is she going down towards the path of picking winners or picking sectors that are important? Very interesting, very much like what for the France do, I think, with what's called the Danone tax or the Danone policy, where they basically defended Danone from a US takeover over there. I think that's right. Yeah, Danone. But other areas too. She talked about communities getting together to form mutuals to explore for oil and gas, which is extraordinary and has been overlooked by everybody, if I can make out, and use competition law to make markets work for people. And she talked again about utility firms and banks. So what does it all mean? Well, here's a different quote I dug out on my work last night. this person said, "We have allowed values which say, take what you can, I'm in it for myself, to create a Britain that is too unequal. The people at the top taking unjustified rewards is not just bad for the economy, it sends out a message throughout society about what values are okay, and inequality reinforces privilege and opportunity for the few." Now that could have come from any of these 4 speeches by Theresa May. It came from Ed Miliband in 2011 in his conference speech, the famous Predators v Producer speech, which we all went for him as a quasi-Marxist. So, so quite where this leaves in this kind of crazy world of 2016, I have no idea. I mean, Theresa May's been allowed to do this and to go after this this kind of middle ground of politics because Jeremy Corbyn has taken such a sharp turn to the left. So this whole area is wide open to a clever politician, and Theresa May is trying to be that person. So just finally on the future, well, it's all about Brexit. So it starts in the new year. Tom will have a very busy time in House of Commons, I imagine, when the Supreme Court loses the article, when the government loses the Article 50 appeal. Although I'm sure you'll be very loyal, not one of the 40 MPs who are going to cause problems this week, are you? Moving on. Okay. We'll ask him. What if you guys ask him later? And I'll write it down.
Experience in not answering Chris's questions. But you, I have less.
It's all to play for. I think I went. But my point on Nissan, that deal with Nissan is very interesting. I think the letter which the Times got obsessed about. I mean, surely that's all about just saying, here's how we can help you without making any promises. So it's going towards seeing not quite state aid, but an intention to help. And I think they will be picking key sectors which are important. So interesting looking at Tata Steel. I mean, I was following that, and then suddenly, the moment Brexit happened, I was told that on the Friday, I was told I understood from people involved in the process that that the steel company was about to go on the Friday, the 24th, after the 23rd, and then silence. And it's extraordinary that we are now very near to a deal being done to save the Port Talbot Steelworks, probably over something about the pension, which of course is weighing the whole company down. Get that sorted, it looks very good. I think that in the future there'll be more picking winners. I think we're going back to a very interesting period, a very un-Thatcherite period we had in the 70s. And just finally, very interesting that Theresa May should appoint her own advisor to advise on tax policy last week, which is brilliant for us. Good for news, possibly not so good for the Tory party. Thank you. Any questions? Do ask me. Thank you.
So, going back to the 70s, that worked so well. So, Adam.
I'll stand up. Doesn't make much of a difference to my height, but I'll do it anyway. It's always hard to speak just after Chris because, of course, he leads you into various alleys, some of them blind, some of them not. But I just want to give a perspective from business communities around the country on how the government is doing. My role really is to represent 52 accredited chambers of commerce that cover the whole of the United Kingdom. We've got over 75,000 businesses in those chambers that have 5 million employees between them. So a very significant chunk of the private sector, and a chunk of the private sector that's focused overwhelmingly outside the M25. So we get the sense of how businesses are doing across the country rather than just the financial services companies in the square mile here, or indeed the Westminster bubble's access to a number of businesses very close by. What we do overwhelmingly is around 4 things as chambers: membership, connecting businesses so that they can do better, focus on places and how those places operate. Chris mentioned Port Talbot, you mentioned Bourneville, you mentioned a lot of the places where our chambers operate, big commitment to business in those areas. Trade as well, we help companies get their goods to market around the world, and then voice, which is my job, representing them in Westminster. I have to say that when it comes to this government, when it comes to Brexit, any of the other themes before us today, the views of business are not monolithic. There's some in the business lobby who spend a hell of a lot of time saying business thinks A, business thinks B. No, they don't. They're just like the voters. There are lots of different views, whether that be on what direction we should take in the Brexit negotiations, whether it be on what the government should be doing to support us, etc. And I think the job of someone like me is to actually represent the diversity of those views rather than just one common received wisdom. And I think that that's hugely important because there are going to be a lot of businesses, a lot of sectors, as Chris was saying a moment ago, putting their own interests forward, and synthesising all of that is extremely, extremely difficult indeed. So 5 months in, how is the government doing? I'll give you what I call my 6 I's to start us off. The first 2 are good, the second 2 are not so good, and the last 2 are ugly. So the good, the bad, and the ugly, as it were. My first 2 are infrastructure and industrial strategy. These are my 2 good I's. On infrastructure, we've seen the government actually progress a couple of things which are hugely important to business confidence with Hinckley Point with the Heathrow decision and HS2. Why are they important? Well, you may or may not agree with the economics of each of the projects or the fundamentals, but they give intangible confidence to businesses. They have huge supply chain and employment opportunities associated with them that ripple out across the regions in the UK. And in many cases, they do things that are very important to business, like keeping the lights on or getting out to markets around the world, or indeed adding capacity into the railway network. So some progress there. We also saw in the autumn statement some progress on roads and the biggest single business infrastructure bugbear, which is broadband. Broadband connectivity outside of big urban centres remains a nightmare. It remains top of the list for a lot of my businesses. No one agrees on anything in the chamber world, yet all 52 chamber leaders across the United Kingdom signed a letter to the last culture secretary saying that broadband is the single biggest business problem and the government's efforts haven't gone far enough to sort it out. So those are the sorts of things where we have seen some progress, because of course there was more money for broadband, there was more money as well for road improvements being brought forward, and of course there's also this newly activist role of the regulator Ofcom on broadband as well, which is going to be hugely important, I think, in trying to drive structural change that can eventually lead to better outcomes for businesses. The other good I is industrial strategy. Deborah, you mentioned back to the 1970s. I don't think that's the case. There's no indication in any of the work that I've been doing week after week with Greg Clark, the business secretary, and others, that we're going back to that sort of environment. There's every indication, however, that we're going to do something which is hugely important, which is focus more on our places and the assets that are in those places around the country, and then how you build on them. We've had a number of industrial strategies. Peter Mandelson had one, Vince Cable had one, great documents which ended up on shelves, nothing ever happened. What's different here this time is Greg is taking an approach where he's saying, actually, in Birmingham, what do I have and how do I build on? And in Manchester, what do I have? You know, in constituencies like yours, Tom, as well, the same thing, the Shire County constituencies. What are the assets in these places, and what do we do as a government in order to support their growth? Do we get the fundamentals right, for example? Are there particular sectors where the area has a competitive advantage, where we might actually seek to do more to support it, help clusters emerge? Government thinks it can create clusters of businesses. It can't. They create themselves, quite frankly. But if government helps places get the conditions right, all of a sudden you see the emergence of some of those clusters. So I think the approach that's being taken at the moment, which is consultative and deliberative, is absolutely right. Chris will hate it, and he'll ask questions of people like Greg Clark and say, where's your industrial strategy? You should have published it 6 weeks ago already. Where is it? Come on, get on with it. That's absolutely wrong. This thing should take time. It should be a 30-year thing. It should be cross-party. And it should be the sort of thing that becomes a guiding document, a bit of a national mission for us, so that we can build this economy in a time of transition. It shouldn't be the sort of thing where they rush out a document to satisfy these jackals over here, and then it disappears, like so many in the past. So this is the right way, this deliberativeness. And one of the things that I think is great about this Prime Minister and her approach to things is she says very clearly, I like process, I like going through the steps of looking at these things. We've seen it now on corporate governance, we're seeing it on industrial strategy. Listening and having that conversation, even if your starting point means you're here and business is over here, is actually important. And we're starting to see some of that emerge, so I'll give them credit for that. So the good, infrastructure and industrial strategy. The bad, intervention and immigration would be my two bad eyes. On intervention, clearly the tone on corporate governance and a range of other things worried businesses around the country. It worried even those who would never be affected by the proposals because their firms were quite frankly too small. Because you create an intangible ripple effect on companies when you say the biggest are going to have to comply with A, B, C, and D. Because guess what happens with most Whitehall red tape? It starts with the biggest and it works its way right down. And you end up with compliance costs on firms of every size. So that was a significant issue for quite a lot of my companies, even though it would never affect them directly. The change in tone over recent weeks, I think, actually marks, exactly as I was saying before, this process of listening, this process of consulting. So long may it continue, because it's very much needed. Otherwise, we could find ourselves in some very bad spots, I think. On immigration, the party conference speech worried a lot of businesses, the Prime Minister's party conference speech. The Home Secretary's propositions at the party conference also worried a lot of businesses. Why? It takes a long time, a lot of money and a lot of commitment to train up people here in the UK. My businesses are absolutely committed to doing it, but in the interim, what do they do? If it takes 5 or 10 years to get people to the skill level that's required, and there are proposals to tighten the immigration system for non-EU, there are proposals for limiting access to EU workers after we leave, and of course, we don't know what's going to happen to the 3 million EU workers who are in our firms now. That adds up to a huge source of worry for firms who are starved for labour, where, you know, in a country which is essentially at nearly full employment. on the official statistics. So I think businesses want an immediate guarantee for the EU workers that are already here. They say take it out of the negotiations, make it a point of principle. You'll win friends and allies across Europe if you say your nationals in the UK can stay, our businesses win, our economy wins, and the exchequer wins as well, of course, because these people are net contributors. And then the ugly. The uglier things which the government can't control, but which of course happen to it. One is information and the other is inflation. Information. The media roller coaster on Brexit and the economy is affecting business sentiment in a big way. You know, these guys have to fill the pages of papers every single day, and in doing so, with the latest twists and turns, the latest cloak and dagger whispers, this, that, and the other thing, it affects business confidence. We see that. And it affects it in a strange way because businesses tend to be inherently confident about themselves, their own business, because if they're not, their business is dead. They then say they're pretty confident about the local area within which they work, their local ties, the ties that bind. They say, yeah, my area will be fine. Then you ask them what's going to happen to the UK, and they'll say it's going to go to hell in a handcart. That's because of these guys. And I think that this information roller coaster, every piece of economic data being seized on as being the absolute proof that one side or the other is right, et cetera, is damaging to businesses. And it's something where government giving a stable and clear message does help. And then on inflation and the impact of the devaluation of sterling, we're just starting to see the effects of this come through, but a lot of firms are being hit. There are some in certain camps that say the devaluation of sterling is absolutely fantastic for British exporters. They clearly don't know too many British exporters who tend to be importers before they export and who tend to be in price-constrained markets where they can't raise their prices particularly much, otherwise they lose the deal to the competition. So the devaluation of sterling has concerned a lot of people. Obviously, we're starting to import a lot more inflation. That will hit next year and in 2018, and it will have an impact. So what we're urging businesses to do is to try to find their way through it, and then you would, of course, urge the government to try to find ways to improve that situation where it can. It doesn't have all the levers at its disposal, but of course it is an issue. So the priorities have to be really stability in the markets, clarity on the time frame for change that's to come ahead. Business knows it's going to face a lot of uncertainty. A lot of businesses are out there looking for opportunity in that uncertainty, which is brilliant, but they'd like to know when things are going to happen. And of course, they want action to support the economy on those things where action is within the UK government's gift directly. They also want 5 things joined up, I think. One is the Brexit strategy. The second is the industrial strategy. The third is the trade strategy. The fourth is fiscal policy. And the fifth is devolution strategy. Sounds like a lot of mouthfuls and a lot of strategies because it is. But quite frankly, what we see at the moment is each of these are being pursued in somewhat different silos. Unless they come together, you don't actually have that sense of national mission and the ability to say, in 30 years' time, our economy will be here. And that's where we want to be as a country because it delivers prosperity. It delivers some of the aims that the Prime Minister set out in that speech on the 11th of July. So, yes, I have said, Deborah, we want a genuine partnership between business and government. I have said that we want to be spoken to and listened to, not dictated to. That is starting to happen. We have noticed a change in the way things are working. Long may that change continue, because without business, government doesn't have the tax revenues it needs to achieve its social and environmental goals, and indeed, it doesn't have the partner that it needs to get through what is likely to be a very momentous period of change. So that's it from our perspective.
Tom, if you'd like to carry on having a go at Chris, please do.
I never have a go at Chris. Chris has a go at me. It's very nice to see you all this morning here because, of course, this is one of the important topics that we're all talking about in Westminster and, of course, the government is talking about behind closed doors. I should, of course, make the caveat, I don't speak for the government. I'm a backbench MP, so that I'm employed by my constituents. I'm not employed by the Prime Minister. She is not, just for the record, my boss, as quite a lot of people seem to say. My boss is 75,000 electors in Tunbridge and Morling, who I work for. We are at a very interesting stage, okay, because we've got a very clear answer to a very complicated question, as we all know, and this has changed the way that a lot of people look at politics, because what we're now looking at is not simply the simplicity of the answer, but the complexity of the question. That sounds like a trite way of looking at it, but if you see what I mean, what we're actually trying to understand is what drove to the answer. Now, there's a whole series of theories that have thrown up, and some of them have been mentioned to do with migration or jams, as Chris elucidated, and some of them to do with various areas left behind. And if you think about it, that's exactly what Theresa May is pointing to, because of course her background is very much pointing at that. And I'm going to disagree with Chris. I don't think she's a suburban Tory in that sense. What she is she's the daughter of a vicar who has grown up listening to the sermons in an Anglican parish church and remembering that there is a combination between duty and responsibility that she feels very strongly. And you could see this in the Home Office. You can see this in the way that she spoke to the Conservative Party as treasurer back in the 2000s, when she really reinforced that element that was to do with the community of the Conservative Party, our national role, even when some people felt that we were so marginalised by Blairism, and the essential honesty that that had. Now, that essential honesty is what you're now seeing coming out in things like the industrial strategy. And you're seeing it very clearly in partnership with the Chief of Staff who was mentioned, Nick Timothy. And it wasn't by accident that that speech on the 11th of July was in Birmingham. Because Birmingham, for Conservatives, speaks to an industrial strategy, an honest industrial strategy of the late 1900s, well, 19th century, sorry, late 1800s. And that era of Joe Chamberlain, okay, I mean, he was a liberal, but only in the sense that, I mean, he certainly wasn't a liberal Democrat. There was nothing SDP about him. And he spoke about an industrial strategy then that is something that we're seeing again today. And that strategy isn't to do with picking winners. It's not a 1970s, we run the British Leyland and we decide who sits on which board or whatever. It's to do with how do you create the environment in which business can prosper, which is why, as Adam spoke, it's all about investing in broadband. And as the announcement today by Chris Grayling was, it's all about how do you get the trains to run properly. Because what you've got is a realisation that it's not about, good Lord, there we go, it's not about the choice of whether you opt for workers on the board of Cadbury's or whether you decide whether or not Pfizer can be bought or sold. It's emphasising that British businesses should have an environment in which they can invest confidently for the future. And this is the business strategy. So the idea that you're going to get a document in 6 weeks' time that says, right, we're going to back Rolls-Royce and we're not going to back Pfizer or whatever it happens to be, is for the birds. That's not going to happen. What is going to happen is a shaped strategy that will look at investing in certain areas. And those areas that you're already hearing are to do with 5G technology. These announcements have largely actually been made, and I suspect that when the strategy comes out, it will be significantly less surprising than people anticipate, because all the markers are down. But look, it's worth thinking, why does she think that? Why does the modern Conservative Party move towards that sort of industrial strategy? And I would again point to the one nation attitude that it holds. Now, many people have argued, what does one nation mean? Some people see it as a sign of the left. Some people see it as a throwback to Disraeli. I don't think it's either of those things. I think it's a realisation that what we are seeing today is a very divided United Kingdom, and we're seeing it across Europe too. Okay, we're seeing it in the United States, and it is throwing up what might be called surprises. Actually, they're not that surprising to anybody who's knocking on doorsteps, even in the beautiful place I have the privilege to represent, will know that 2 months before the referendum, there was no surprise at the answer. There was absolutely no surprise at the answer. And the answer was very clearly chosen, even by people who were working in the city. You know, I was knocking on doors of a lot of folk who were in investment, in financial management of some kind, who were feeling that the system wasn't responding to them. And so what she's doing is she's addressing that. And that, the way you address that is through honesty. Now, I know various people in this room, Dan, you've done it a bit, and other people have looked at it, and that's the reason I'm really interested in it, are looking at financial transparency as a form of that honesty. Now, there are various other forms of it, making sure that the BHS pensions aren't spent on yachts in Monaco is one form of it. But that form of honesty in investment, that honesty in finance, that honesty in industry, is exactly what the Prime Minister is looking to do. And as I say again, I'm not speaking for her, so I'm not telling you her policies because I don't know the details of what she's planning. But all I can tell you is the mood of the Conservative Party is certainly not anti-business. That's not the message at all. There's absolutely no desire to start throwing taxes up to 70% or whatever it was that Labour did in the 70s. That's not the plans. The plan is just to make sure that what we don't get is a rapacious form of capitalism that sees business as simply a way of profit stripping, asset stripping. Now, how do you do that? Well, transparency is really important. Who owns property in the United Kingdom is becoming an ever more important question, which is why the concept of ultimate ownership that has been pushed again and again and again through various bills through Parliament is getting more and more weight. Because until you know who owns something, you have no idea what's going on behind it. The same as the concept that's coming in financial management. Now, various firms are responding to this. Orbis has responded to it. Various other firms have responded to it. Others have led on it, forgive me, actually. But various firms have responded to it. And what we're getting is an environment in which it is harder for various of the asset managers to cream off a few percent here or there and use that Einsteinian concept of combined annual growth rate to end up doing rather better than the investor. So what we're seeing is this, it's a mood change. And it's a mood change in response, as I say, to a popular mood. This isn't, democracy does respond to the people. I know people often feel it doesn't, but it really does. Because if you want to know who's knocking on more doors, you can be pretty sure it's the politicians. I'm afraid it's not the journalists. If you really want to know where the mood of the country is, it's the people who are meeting them in the surgery every week and who are knocking on doors and who are meeting them at various groups, not too dissimilar to this, who tend to have a better feel of it. And I can tell you quite seriously that from retired folk through to young working people, even in leafy West Kent, this mood against a form of aggressive, these words sound more loaded than they actually are, but a mood of against this sort of aggressive asset stripping form of capitalism has grown and grown and grown. So much so that you now have, very strongly, a response from the Conservative Party towards it. Now that isn't, I say again, that is not a new form of socialism. That is not a new form of common ownership of everything. It simply isn't. What it is a recognition that business has a role in the community, and that role is to support the community, to provide employment, to provide profit that we all benefit from, not simply to enrich one or two. Now, we'll see how these changes come through, and Chris has highlighted several of them. Adam has pointed to many other areas that I think are going to start making a major difference. But there's 2 points I would just like to touch on very briefly that I think people are aware of, but may not fully appreciate. And the first is the Brexit negotiations that are ongoing at the moment. We all know, and forgive me, some of you may be in this room, we all know that some of the larger firms are spending an awful lot of money on lobbyists to make sure that their points are heard, so that as these negotiations go forward, they have at least the ear of the minister, if not the mouth of the minister, at the negotiating table. One of the things that I have been doing, and many of my colleagues have been doing, is going around the small business communities who have also felt left out, not just the individuals, but the small business communities have also felt left out. And we have been harvesting as much of what they want to feed back in. Because the point about our system of government is it only works if you inform those who are supposed to represent you. If you don't inform them, there's nothing they can do to help you. So there's a lot of Conservative MPs, and I presume there's quite a lot of Labour MPs as well, and probably some SNP too, and I think both Liberal Democrats are doing it, who are going around and asking businesses what they want. Because these negotiations are going to shape the United Kingdom for the next 40, 50 years. Whether we choose, what kind of access we choose to the single market, what kind of understanding we have of the customs union, are going to fundamentally shift the economic future that we will have and that our children will have. So one of the things that I am doing, and I would urge those of you who work with small businesses, forgive me, Stefan, don't employ the hugely expensive lobbyist if you can't afford it. Go and see your MP, because that is actually our job now, in a very different way to the way it was, a number of years ago. It is a very specific, go and see your MP now and make sure they understand what it is that your firm or that you want. The second thing is inflation. Now, it's always said that generals fight the last war. And of course, to a certain extent, that's true. Generals do. But actually, we all do. We all fight the last battle that we understood and won. And there is a real danger today, I would argue, that the last time we fought hyperinflation was in the 1930s. And everybody who fought it is now dead. It is very important today that our central banks remember those lessons, because they will not have, as the Germans put it, the Fingerspitzengefühle for the changes that come that point to the emergent moments. And if we miss the early signals, we could well find ourselves in a very interesting position. Now, I'm not saying that hyperinflation of 200%, but even in today's economy, hyperinflation actually would, 5 or 6% would feel like hyperinflation in a funny way. So making sure that we are responsive and learn lessons of the past has become significantly more important. This is also now pushed back onto the political class of which I now find myself. The reality is that a lot of the policies that we are seeing enacted today are political decisions conducted by non-political actors. What do I mean by that? If you look at the quantitative easing policies that have been conducted over the last, well, pretty much 6-7 years by central banks around the world, those are fundamentally political decisions. The decisions that the central bank has made was to prioritise one form of investor over another, was to prioritise one asset class over another, was effectively to pick winners in an economic world. Now that, in many ways, is a political decision. But the pressure was put off politicians and onto central bankers to take those decisions. Now, you may argue that those were the right decisions. In fact, I'm certainly not going to question them now, because in many ways they kept the economy as stable as it could. But all I mean is that what we are doing is we are remembering today that politics has a role of its own, and it isn't the same as management. The most extreme example of it is being discussed in the Supreme Court today. We have effectively 11 judges who are doing their very, very best to stay out of politics. And I'm afraid I'm not going to follow some of Chris's colleagues, despite the fact that I would vote in favour of Article 50, because I think it's impossible as a Democrat not to. Those judges are doing their best to stay out of politics. And if you read the judgment of the High Court a few weeks back, the Lord Chief Justice was very clear that he wanted nothing to do with politics, and what he was trying to do was be as purely legalistic as possible. But what he's found himself, or what they have found themselves in, is a political arena. And I would argue that the best thing we can do for our institutions, because guarding our institutions, I think, a fundamental political role, is to get them out of it. And the way I would get them out of it is to have the vote as soon as possible, so that their decision was not the political choice, but simply a legal one. Anyway, there's a few points. Thank you.
Lots of food for thought there. Okay, so now we're going to get your questions. So if I could ask you to raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and tell us, if you could tell us your name and your organisation, that would be really helpful.
I'll just pick up on one point on the transparency, not the area I'm most passionate about, which is fund management, but the property market. Can anything actually be done? Because if you look at central London property at the moment, it seems to have taken on the sort of characteristic, or the functional characteristics of Swiss bank accounts for the global elite. I mean, is there anything we can actually do to solve these problems? You wander around some of these high-end properties at night, and then there's nobody living there.
Is that for me, or is that for you?
Yeah.
You brought it up.
That's a big
Well,
question.
they're looking at it, aren't they? I mean, Eric Pickles is looking at benefits, who owns these properties, and much more disclosure. It does offend, though, when you wander around at night time and there are no lights on in these flats. I mean, no one's living there.
But beneficial ownership is exactly the point you're coming to, Dan, and it's a really important question, because, of course, flats in London, I mean, I don't care where they are, but they are not gold bars to be stored under the bed. And they are, this is going to be really boring, so stop me when you've had enough. In in the early 1300s, the king found a third of the land. You're done, okay.
I'm not sure if we've got enough time. Right, back to 1300.
The king found that the third of the land was owned by the church, and this effectively meant that a third of the asset class of the Kingdom of England was not tradable. And you can understand how that might put a block on the ability of an economy to grow or to develop. He passed what's called the Statute of Mortmain, which removed mortmain, the dead hand of the church, from the land. We are approaching, I would argue, a similar situation in certain areas where we need to encourage these properties to come back into circulation. And it doesn't really matter, if one thinks about it, whether they are rented out or whether they are sold, but they must be used. Because the alternative is that you effectively freeze a significant portion of the asset class of housing in the UK, and this pushes up problems for everyone. Now, how do you do that is tricky, because of course there are many people who are quite adept at jumping through hoops. So if you were to say, oh well, it must be used at least a day a month, you would find that there was a market in people who bed hopped, or flat hopped rather. So you've got to look at it. Now, one of the areas that the government is looking at, and I found this out actually from you, Chris, so thank you, was in looking at the beneficial ownership and looking at consequent fraud or abuse charges. So people's assets in the UK could be seized for abuses abroad, and this was done particularly in relation to the Magnitsky cases in Russia, where, as you know, a fellow was murdered by some friends of Uncle Vladimir, and the United States government froze the assets and prosecuted several of the, froze the assets and prosecuted the firms of several of the people said to be responsible. And there is a response in the UK now, sort of pushing towards that. It's not a big answer. That's a very small answer. I get it, but it's this idea that you identify who's a beneficial owner and start to do something about it is important. I mean, the problem, of course, for the UK property market is that everybody else is doing worse. And if you are an Italian family, and this we are seeing a lot these days, Italian or Greek family, you club together with your friends and cousins, and you buy a flat in London as an insurance policy against whatever might happen. And it's hard. It's very hard to stop that happening if you do, as I do, believe in free trade.
I think you need to separate the big question of transparency that Tom raised before from some of the totemic issues that we see as examples of it. Lights off in a few mansions in Mayfair is a totemic example. Some of the ownership questions around companies that we've seen are totemic examples, because what we end up doing is creating legislative frameworks and things like that affect businesses of all sizes, those who are doing all the right things, who are indeed entirely transparent, in order to get to a few. So the crafting of anything that one might do in order to try to increase transparency and increase the sort of fundamental honesty has got to be extraordinarily careful. And governments do not have a good track record in that space, I have to say. So whilst most of my businesses, are UK domiciled, have done everything right forever and ever, amen. Some of them have been in existence. I'm doing an event in a couple of weeks' time where 5 original members of a Chamber of Commerce that have been members for the past 100 years will be present. You have these kinds of commitments and these kinds of roots in local places. They're all for transparency because they see lack of transparency as a generator of unfair competition. However, they're almost more afraid of the medicine than they are of the disease itself in certain cases. You've got to be very careful when doing these things.
No, I agree entirely. I think it's definitely about transparency. What Eric Biggles is doing, who's the anti-corruption champion in the Cabinet Office, is trying to this issue of beneficial ownership. But I wonder how far the government can go to encourage these properties to get back into circulation. That sounds quite Marxist to me. You're going to sort of force the sale of properties from people if they don't use them. But that's what you're saying. That's quite out there.
I'm not saying that. I'm just
He's not saying that. Gentleman in the front there. You.
Hi,
Ross Whitson from Shell. I'm intrigued in what the panel views on UK energy policy. I think, Tom, you were talking about honesty and an honest conversation. Adam, you were talking about a good partnership between business and government and everyone listening to each other. Because I feel that we've never, unfortunately, had a really joined-up energy policy as a country for many a year, and let's hope perhaps there will be one in the near future. And I mean, and Christopher, you were talking about perhaps there's a move towards more pro-British businesses rather than international companies. Well, of course, energy policy arguably is one of the most international business areas that we have. There's so many different supply chains within that mix, internationally and in the UK. I'm very intrigued in your collective views of government energy policy just right now and in the future.
Right.
So that's to all, I'm afraid.
Go on then.
I'll kick it off. I think energy policy is one of a range of different areas where there is simply too much change. This is a common theme of this country, which is not quite as common in many of our competitor nations. We start policies 1 month, 5 months later we're thinking about changing them, and 10 months later we do change them. Whereas business has timescales, if they hear about it in a year, they're starting to engage with it after 5, and they're comfortable with it after 10. So our policy-making timescales, and the fact that we reform endlessly and tinker endlessly rather than let things stay in place, is a big part of our problem. Energy is a perfect example of that. One government or one energy secretary comes in and favours one particular generation channel, and that becomes flavour of the month. And then people like Chris will run campaigns against the next generation channel. So, one day windmills are great, the next day they're horrible. What kind of signal does that send for investment? And what kind of signal does it send to the businesses who are ultimately paying the bills at the other end and the consumers who are ultimately paying the bills at the other end? We are all paying the bills for disjointed policy and too much change. An example of policy where you don't have that is German apprenticeships. Why do they work? They've been exactly the same for 65 years. Everyone knows how to use them. It's not rocket science, but it's something we've never learned the lesson of. A bit longer than that.
Sounds like Adam doesn't like democracy.
Yes, going back to the Holy Roman Empire and the guilds. We can, I can go back to the 1300s as well, but I won't.
Let's not do that. Tom, given that you, I believe, when you worked at the city, worked in the energy market.
Yeah, well, I've more followed them. I wish I could say I did any better than that. But energy policy is incredibly complicated for the very simple reason that it affects absolutely everything. I do remember one of my first lessons in politics was a number of years ago. I was, it's one of those bizarre things that you do every now and again. I was showing a French finance minister around Afghanistan. I'm not quite sure why I wanted to see it, but there we go. And it was at a time that oil prices were very high, and he wasn't terribly concerned about oil prices. And I sort of expressed some surprise at that. And he said, of course, it's not the oil prices that kill people, it's gas prices. When gas prices go too high, people switch off their electricity, off their heating, and people in France die. And that's sort of rather a sort of a nugget of how you see the interaction between social policy, energy policy, and indeed foreign policy. And that's the fundamental problem with this, because, of course, there's nothing you can do to nail down foreign policy, as we've discovered on many different occasions. So the question that the government is trying to wrestle with is how do you at least get minimum generation for the long term in energy. Now, I know that the early days of this administration, the Hinckley question, was something that was bounced around a bit. But I would argue that now we've got a pretty solid energy policy, which is effectively you've got a couple of anchors. Some of that's offshore wind, some of that's nuclear. And you've got an increasing emphasis on non-renewable generation as the what's it called, the variable. Now, we'll see whether the government changes much through its energy strategy, through its business strategy, but I suspect it won't. And I suspect it won't for exactly the same reason as we mentioned earlier, that this isn't going to be I doubt very much that this is going to be a strategy that says, oh, right, suddenly we're going to go, we'll go left flanking. It's rather more that this is going to be a strategy that sets out the idea for long-term reliability in energy supply. And I think that the decisions they've taken in the last few months, well, in fact, over the last few years, set forward the possibility of being assured of that continuous supply.
Yeah, well, in politics, it's all driven by the price for the customer. I mean, Adam has a go at us for tackling onshore wind farms, and the uncertainty around that. Well, I mean, I think this is just democracy, frankly, if you'll forgive me for saying that, because I think if people don't like them and enough of them, people get upset about them, then we're going to write about them, including even Donald Trump urging Nigel Farage to tackle wind farms on the Scottish coast, although those are offshore and they're spoiling his views. That's different. But I think, yeah, we are quite sort of structured around a baseload of always on nuclear with coal to vary it, aren't we? There are elements going forward on mini generators around towns and cities, and I think fracking will come back as your oil price rises and that will become more economically viable. And the government is certainly in favour of that. But again, it's trying to take communities with you. And I go back to what Theresa May talked about, mutuals, investing for oil and gas. One of her points she made in Birmingham, Emma's forgotten. What does that mean? I don't know. But she certainly wants to carry people along with you. It's not about imposing things that people don't want. They have got to have a stake in it. And that's where we're going. I think that, I know it's concerning for you, all the people, but I mean, I think so there are some basic consensus around energy policy, which is, a good base load and some variable from coal and gas, and everything else around the edges is uncertain, but that's the nature of democracy.
My name's Matthew Patton. I work for the Mayor's Fund for London. I was interested in some of the reflections you made about following the mood and going and talking to your MP about all sorts of things, including business policy. And one of the things I was struck by the question was, has this Conservative government fallen out of love with business? I would suggest that the people have fallen out of love with business, or are in serious danger of falling out of love with business. And it seems to me that over the past, 2 decades, 3 decades, we find ourselves in a situation where kind of Western democratic leaders are so relatively poor in terms of their stature, with apologies to Theresa May and others. But when you look around, what's happening in America, what's happening in the UK, what's happening in Europe, the quality of leadership is really, really poor. And over the same period, what we've seen is the quality of leadership within business, and particularly big international business, and this conversation has been very domestic really up to now, but on a global level has been completely changed. And issues around large global corporations having a much bigger impact in terms of the world that we live in as citizens, as much as I say, politicians and all the rest of it. And it seems to me that 2 things come out of that question for me. First of all, I think business, particularly big business, I separate that with small community businesses, really have to grasp their responsibility about having some kind of social purpose beyond returns to the shareholder. I think there's a real moral value in that as well. But they really need to do that, particularly at an international scale. And the second thing is, I don't think populism has trumped profit. I think unfairness, or a sense of unfairness and injustice, is the biggest risk to profit that is currently out there. I think people, whatever their background, whether they're rich or poor or whatever, are getting an increasing sense of deep unfairness at the heart of our society. And if we do not do something, if our politicians do not something about that, then we will not have peaceful revolutions like Brexit. And if companies do not do something about it, they will not be in business for very long, because people will take it away from them. So I'd be interested in your views about that.
I agree. I completely agree, really. I think you could argue that it's not just big business. I mean, the US is the most successful businessman has become president, so it's not all businesses.
Sure that's true.
Well, yes. I mean,
Well, no, I'm questioning the most successful businessman stature, not the fact that he's president.
Very successful businessman. Okay, well, we haven't seen his tax returns, have we? So we don't know for sure. I think you're right. I think unfairness, my personal view is you need to get council houses need to be built. I think there needs to be some massive state intervention on housing. I think the market will not fix it. Why would house builders build more homes and damage their margins? It's not going to happen. And the single biggest unfairness is housing, I think. And I think you need to have a huge social housing programme from the Tory government, ironically.
I'd agree that the people are in danger of falling out of love with business, and what business needs to remember is that it needs a licence to operate from society. It only operates successfully with the consent of the society in which it's based. I'm really lucky. I've got 75,000 businesses who have joined an organisation whose purpose is to make the place where they do business better. They have a civic commitment. You go back to, you talked about Nick Timothy and the sort of Chamberlain vision of what a city should be. Well, a Chamber of Commerce has in it the businesses who are doing the sort of learn, earn, return sort of model, and they're often, many will be there to earn, and a lot will be there to return. And when you build on that, what you start to see is that there is a great civic commitment in so many of our businesses. The problem is it gets overshadowed by a small number, many of them international, many of them transient, many of them fleet of foot in terms of the investment decisions that they make. And I think you have to separate out. Some big businesses are great corporate citizens. They're great for places, they commit, they engage supply chains, they do everything they can to really become part of the fabric of the community in which they operate, and then have a high loyalty from that community in turn. Others do not. And I think the attention needs to be on how you encourage those who are less rooted to become more rooted, because they keep their license to operate, and you get some solutions to some of the problems of unfairness and perceived inequality and everything else that affects so many people.
I agree with this. I mean, I'm reminded, forgive me for going back again, my uncle wrote a book called The Multinationals in the 1970s talking about this exact phenomenon, and I would argue it isn't new. It's perhaps got more extreme, but it isn't new. And I agree absolutely that the perception of unfairness is significantly more important than the perception of profit. One of the best businesses in my constituency is an aggregates company, and they are extremely good at reinvesting locally. Now, the guy who owns it happens to have done exceptionally well for himself, but nobody begrudges him it. You then look at different firms around the area, and you can see exactly the reverse. Now, if you look at the areas that have really caused huge issues in my mailbag are things like Starbucks and Google, who haven't paid their tax anywhere, or appear not to have paid their tax anywhere. And that's the level of unfairness that I think that Theresa May is looking to cover with her areas of transparency and areas of responsibility. I do argue that although politicians have clearly have some power to change some of this behaviour, these are societal issues, and a lot of them are very difficult to change if we're not willing to engage. Now, it sounds simple to say, oh well, why don't we, massively tax Amazon or something like that in order to make sure that the profits stay domestic, and we can to a certain extent. But of course, what you do is you then increase costs, and of course, people then complain about rising prices. And given that inflation is...
I don't think that's right, Tom, with respect. I think it's not a question of massively taxing Amazon or whatever. What it is about doing some of the things which would be really in businesses' interests, but which would show real leadership. So the problem that people have with tax is not so much, or it's not as well as the people not paying. It's absolutely Byzantine that nobody can work out how tax works. And Conservatives, who are a pro-business party, have increased the level of complexity around taxation, whilst at the same time saying that they intend to simplify it. I think simplifying it and being more transparent, which I think is something you're already passionate about, would be a real step forwards in that respect. And that would show political leadership in the face of corporate confusion.
And there are a bunch of us trying to push for much simpler tax systems, and every time we push for it, we get the Treasury coming up with new and interesting ideas as to how to tweak it a bit more. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it is a fundamental problem of... It's one of those classic issues. When you put somebody in charge of the Treasury, they work out new and interesting ways of influencing the economy and seeing the world change in the way they wish to, rather than in recognising that their job is to get the money out of the, to pluck the goose with the least amount of squawking possible. Now, that is something we haven't been great at, I would admit.
Right, we're just going to have a couple more questions. Lady in the middle.
Yes, can I just ask a question to all the panellists, followed by a very quick supplementary? Do you think the lack of transparency around the Nissan deal is a good thing? And the supplementary is, why should a special deal be done by Nissan, but not for the firms in the City of London?
Good question, right. Who's going to take that first? Well, go on, Chris.
But it's neither a good or a bad thing, it's an understandable thing, isn't it? I mean, essentially, you're not allowed to give any state aid to Nissan or to help them while we're in the EU. So you can make some woolly promises about future help with R&D and other elements, and it gets around that issue, I think. It's entirely understandable. I mean, I think it's... I think the anti-Brexiteers are trying to use it to batter the government, but I think it's entirely understandable what they've done there, and I have no problem with it at all.
What this leads me back to is the fact that no planning seems to have been done prior to the referendum, quite frankly, because it would have been very easy for a government to say this vote could go in either direction, and to think about the eventualities for big employers in areas where actually the political sensitivity of that employment is so great, and the impact economically on people of that employer going is so great. I would have thought a lot of this would have been done, and there would have been thought already given to it, and I think that's my biggest disappointment, because then things like this have to happen. I think, you know, I was delighted to see that Nissan did make the commitment to stay in the northeast of England. My chamber in the northeast of England is incredibly strong, and the number of businesses and the number of people who are touched by that investment in that particular part of the country is enormous. So you can see why a government would seek to do its very best in order to keep that investment in place. I am troubled because I don't know what it's opened the door up to in terms of others who will be coming with similar demands. You know, if you go to a variety of the events that we have talking about Brexit and things like that, someone will stand up and say, supposedly from an ideologically pure view, we need to do X, this is the thing we need to do in Brexit, like come out of the common external tariff. And then you ask the person where they come from, and the reason they want to come out of the common external tariff is they're a lobbyist for a company negatively affected by the common external tariff. It's about their business model. It's not about what's best for the UK. And if we have company after company lining up and going for what's best for its business model, we will have a real mess on our hands. So we have to be a bit careful into how far this goes.
But having said that, if we look at financial services, if you saw the stat this morning, we make £74 billion out of financial services. And you know, if we haven't rebalanced the economy, financial services are absolutely vital to this country.
I think my point is you have to make the rounded economic argument when you think about individual sectors or the interests of individual sectors. There are companies out there who are making the argument on behalf of their own business model and their narrow interest, and that is what needs not to be listened to.
I'm not sure I agree with that, actually, Adam. I do think that businesses should be explaining their narrow interests and their particular business models, and that the job of those of us who represent them in various different ways, either in Parliament or through the CBI, is to aggregate those and to find what's the best, what is the best for the whole nation. Now, that isn't easy, but I'm reminded of when soldiers always used to tell politicians they're giving politically informed military advice. It invariably meant that they'd misunderstood the politics and were giving crap military advice. What they need to do is to give the best military advice they can give, and the best military advice they can give is on the basis of their experience and the military situation they find in front of them. And I would argue that's the same with business today. Then let the politicians, the lobbying groups, whoever it happens to be, to aggregate that knowledge and to find the best way through it.
But I think the businesses need to be transparent about what they're doing. If they're out there saying, this is what's good for my business model, this is what I have experience in, that's okay. If they're out there parading something that's good for their business model as being the right solution for the UK, which some of them are doing, I have a problem with that.
Okay, I mean, I think it would be surprising if any of them were parading business models that were not for their interest. So I'm a little bit more relaxed about it.
Let's be realistic. The financial services industry is absolutely critical to this country. And I don't know if you saw the front page of the business section of the Telegraph this morning and then looked at the FT. I was somewhat concerned whether the government was doing a special deal for the financial services industry or wasn't doing a. Yeah. So I think the lady's question is very apposite. What is going to happen, especially when you've got Michel Barnier on the other side of the negotiation, somebody who's very pro the City of London, not.
Barnier's interests are very clearly the European Union and the future economic growth that they're going to have. And let's not kid ourselves that he's going to do us a deal that will be in our advantage. That doesn't, however, mean that it will be against our advantage, because, as I say, his interests are very strongly in the European Union. And you only have to look at Italy today and the confusion in the Italian banking sector to realise that they are as reliant on the City of London as the United Kingdom is in many ways. I mean, Mark Carney put it very well when he said that London is the investment banker for Europe, and it's absolutely true. Now, the situation we're getting to sounds like what we're doing is arguing for special interest, whether it be Nissan today or the city tomorrow. But the reality is what we've got to do is we've got to set out, we get back to the business strategy question, we've got to set out various options that are good for everyone. And let's not kid ourselves that Nissan stayed in Sunderland because it got some epic deal that is based on a business secretary remaining in post for the next 25 years. That's not what they did. What they did is they looked at the conditions in France where they have a plant and various other places where they have plants, and they looked at the conditions in the United Kingdom, and then they went to see the government and threatened to leave unless they got a really, really, a better offer. Now, I don't know what that offer was, but it was perfectly possible that that offer is, we'll do the best we can. It's perfectly possible that that piece of paper says, don't know, but this is what we're working towards. I doubt very much that that piece of paper says, and we guarantee you X% off, whatever. I doubt it. Now, I don't know, I haven't seen the paper any more than you have, but the reality is that firms like Nissan are going to be making business decisions not based on a small deal, which, let's face it, it would be, on government backing or not backing, because after all, I think it's exceptionally unlikely, but it is possible that Corbyn wins the next election. It is possible that we have a very different government in 3 or 4 years' time. So that's not what they're making the decision on. They're making the decision on the fact that Sunderland offers an enormous pool of talented workforce who have long experience of building cars, who have, as Adam put it, a network of other supporting businesses that feed into it. And the same is true of the city. I know that the Banque de France has been putting together various offers to try and lure in American banks. I know that Frankfurt and Paris as cities have been putting together various offers. But the reason people aren't immediately leaping at it isn't just because of regulation or taxation. It's to do with everything from schools and housing and where does your wife live? All these sort of things, these sort of soft anchors, if you like, that create a resistance to change. Now, this doesn't mean that the UK can be complacent. It certainly doesn't, because we could see a significantly worse position over 20 years if we are. But the idea that we're going to hit a cliff edge and it's all going to suddenly go wrong, I think is not the case. I think what we're much more likely to see is to see an ongoing period of negotiation where the city, in conversation with the UK government, and let's not forget a lot of these banks operate in Europe, lobbying their European arms and reminding them that most euro debt is handled in London, and if you actually do want to refinance the Italian banks, you'd better not be quite as mean to London as you think. All that sort of period of negotiations means that, of course, our interaction with the European Union, both at an economic and political level, is very far from over.
Absolutely. Right. I promised the speakers that we'd finish at 9:30. Oops. I'm sure you'll join with me to thank them for a very stimulating and very interesting tour d'horizon from 1300 onwards. Thanks very much.